In today's video, I'm going to be doing a Clash Royale tier list where I'm ranking every single card in Clash Royale for the month of June. And oh my goodness, guys, has the meta completely changed since last month. We have gotten balance changes since then. We have had a new update where there's 3 new Goblin cards and the game feels completely different than it did a month ago, which is why I'm doing it at the end of the month, because I felt like I needed more time to grasp the meta and understand it because of how different it is now. As always, S tier means the card is very, very good, potentially needs a nerf, or at the bare minimum, it is just very versatile. A tier means the card is well above average. B tier is the upper end of average. C tier is the lower end of average, maybe slightly below average. D tier means the card is kind of bad, but you can make it work. F tier means the card either needs a buff or it is not versatile at all. Starting off with the archers, I'm going to put them in D tier. They're overall a pretty weak support card, and I believe the main reason people use them is just to eventually get to the evolved archers, but the regular ones aren't really that good. Arrows are a very good spell, and it's going in A tier. Last month, they were absolutely broken, and I had them in S tier. Since then, things have changed a little bit now that there's the Void as well as the Goblin Curse in the game, which a lot of people are using instead. But with that being said, arrows are still amazing to have inside of Lava Hound and Giant decks because of the radius and how good it is against swarms. The Baby Dragon's going in C tier. It's kind of an average card at the moment. It's a flying splash card that can get a lot of value in a lot of situations, but I think the problem for the Baby Dragon is things like Golem and Splash Yard are very hard to use at the moment, so Baby Dragon isn't being played much now. The Bandit's going in B tier. I think she's a little bit better now, especially after the recent P.E.K.K.A buff and the recent Ram Rider buff, because she pairs very well with those cards. But with that being said, she's not a requirement inside a P.E.K.K.A deck, so she isn't super strong at the moment, and she's pretty easy to counter if you know what you're doing. The Barbarian Barrel, I'm going to put in C tier. Usually I rank it higher than this, but I think at the moment it's a lot worse for a few reasons. One, of course, is the Dagger Duchess. It won't even end up reaching the tower and getting any chip damage when you're playing against that. On top of that, a lot of the beatdown decks at the moment are preferring to use things like the Evolve Zap, the Void, and the Goblin Curse, so we're seeing less Barb Barrel at the moment. Some things seem to never change. The Barbarian Hut, as per usual, is going in F tier. It is just so easy to counter with spells like the Earthquake and the Poison, for example, and also it just has pretty much no synergy in any deck. The Barbarians are joining the Archers in D tier, and just a note, I'll be ranking all the evolutions at the end of the tier list. Just like the Archers, the main reason people use them is just to get to the evolved version, because the regular Barbarians are pretty weak and die to Fireball, and the only deck you're going to see them in is Lava Hound, and even inside of Lava Hound, many people are using Guards instead nowadays. The regular Bats are also going in D tier. I feel like they are just way too vulnerable to spells. The Dagger Duchess is also very good against them, and they just don't really fit well in many decks in this current meta. Believe it or not, guys, the Balloon is one of the strongest win conditions in this meta, and it is going to be the first S tier card. Normally, I don't put it as high as S tier, but there are so many people using Lava Loon at the moment, or even Balloon decks with the Giant, or even Balloon Cycle. So it's fairly versatile because there's a lot of different variations of Balloon you can play. And I think one of the biggest reasons why Balloon is so good at the moment is Evolve Zap is one of the strongest evolutions, which pairs very nicely with the Balloon. And some of the really broken cards at the moment in the game, such as the Goblin Demolisher, doesn't attack air, and also the Goblin Machine isn't really that good against the Balloon either, which I think really helps the Balloon out at the moment. The Battle Healer's going in D tier. There's pretty much no one running Elixir Golem or Golem at the moment, so she just simply isn't being used. The regular Battle Ram is going in D tier. Even though P.E.K.K.A's in a pretty good spot, pretty much all P.E.K.K.A players prefer to use the Ram Rider over the Battle Ram, especially after the Ram Rider buff. The only reason people would play the regular Battle Ram is to get to that evolved one, but the regular one for the most part kind of sucks and almost never reaches the tower, especially if your opponent knows what they're doing. The Bomber's going to go in B tier. I feel like it's a pretty good card, definitely not too strong, but not that weak either. It's fairly versatile because you can use it in cycle decks with Drill if you want to, but you can also use it in heavier decks with the Lava Hound. But of course, its evolution is really, really broken, and that's probably a big part of why people play it. But I do think the regular Bomber itself is still pretty solid. The Bomb Tower is going to go in C tier. I don't think the Bomb Tower is necessarily a bad building at all. The issue is the Tesla is just so much better than every building in the game that it makes all the other buildings not really needed to be used at all in the current meta. The Bomb Tower has a decent amount of hit points and it does splash, so it's solid on defense, but it doesn't hit air, which is why it's not that great when there's a lot of Lava Hound and Balloon in the meta. The Bowler's going to go in A tier. It is a very, very strong support card defensively and also even on offense when you have a counter push coming in, because the rocks it throws have such a long range that it can line up pretty much at the bridge and almost reach the tower sometimes. And it has a lot of hit points too, which is partly why it gets so much value. But I don't think it is too broken because at the moment, there's not a ton of decks he's being used in besides Giant. Cannon's going to go in B tier. It's a bit better than the Bomb Tower, but still not great currently. It is pretty good though inside of Hog decks and Royal Hog Cycle. Cannon card's going to go in D tier. Last tier list, I put it in F tier, but it's finally slightly more viable again. After the recent Dark Goblin buff, I'm seeing a couple people use the Cannon cart with Rascal's Bait Dark Goblin, so it's not completely horrible anymore. The Clone is going to go in F tier. There's just simply way too many counters to it. There's a lot of people using the Tornado, the Poison, arrows, and there's just not really any deck it fits in. No one is playing Lava Clone anymore or Giant Skeleton with Clone. The Dark Prince is going to go in B tier. I think it's an okay support card. You'll sometimes see him in things like E-Giant or with the Giant, but I think overall, he's not really that great and fairly easy to deal with too. The Dark Goblin's also going to go in B tier. He is a lot better now after the damage buff he got. He went up from D to B, so a pretty good jump, and he's being played a lot again inside of bait decks. The Earthquake is also going in B tier. I think the reason why it's not higher than that is because of the Void, and Void replaced Earthquake in a lot of decks, but with that being said, Earthquake is still amazing to have inside of Hog decks and with Royal Hogs. The Electro Drag is going to go in D tier. I think he is just kind of struggling in this current meta because Golem is not in a good spot at the moment. And also Lumberloon Freeze for a while hasn't really been that viable, so the E-Drag isn't good at the moment. The Electro Giant is going to go in B tier. He is a pretty strong win condition, definitely a bit above average, and certainly better than the Golem. I think one of the biggest reasons why is there's a lot of people running Balloon and also Lava Hound, and he's one of the few counters in the meta to that deck. The Electro Spirit's going in A tier. It gets so much value for only one elixir, and it's quite versatile, especially in cycle decks. You can use it with Logbait, you can use it with Drill, you can use it with Expo, and you don't even really have to worry about King activations anymore, because when you're against the Dagger Duchess, she's going to end up killing the E-Spirit before it even reaches the tower, so you can't really get a King activation off of it. The Electro Wizard is going to go in D tier. I feel like he's just not really needed to be played because there's so many better alternatives than him, so you're only going to see him in P.E.K.K.A Bridge Spam, and that's kind of about it. But even inside of P.E.K.K.A, there's better options than him. Believe it or not, guys, I'm going to put the Archer Queen in C tier. Even though she recently got a buff, she at the moment is pretty bad for a champion. The Little Prince and the Monk are just simply a lot better than her at the moment, and there isn't really a single deck in this meta that she is used in, so for that reason, she's kind of an average card. The E-Barbs are going in D tier. There's pretty much no deck that they're used in. They're pretty much just a mid-ladder menace card that can be kind of annoying to deal with when they're over-leveled, but when both opponents have the same level cards and a pretty good deck, they usually get stopped right in their tracks, which is why they're only in D tier and pretty bad overall. Elixir Collector kind of sucks at the moment. It's going in D tier. It really fell off ever since Void came into the game. It's funny because a few months ago, it was all the way in S tier, and then Void brought it all the way down to D, and it's pretty much impossible to play in this meta because it's getting almost no value in so many matchups. The Elixir Golem is going to be going into D tier as well, and I think part of the reason is because the Elixir Collector is in a bad spot, and just E-Golem has a very difficult time finding a place in this meta. There isn't really anyone using it or any E-Golem deck that is good. The Executioner is also going in D tier simply because, kind of like the E-Golem, has a hard time finding a spot in this meta. The Void is also a really good counter to him, and what you guys might notice this tier list is there might be more cards in D tier than normal, simply because there's a lot of broken cards in this meta that the meta is a bit unbalanced. So as a result, there's going to be a lot of cards that are well below average as a result. The Fireball is going in A tier. It's a really nice direct damage spell that is pretty versatile. There's a lot of people using it with Expo, Goblin Drill, Giant, Royal Giant, Hog, and more, so it's in a pretty good spot in this meta. The regular Firecracker is going to be going in D tier. For the most part, she's pretty weak and not that good. The main deck she is played in is Hog, at least at the top of ladder, but I know in mid ladder there's a lot of people running her in wacky decks, but I think overall she isn't really that good if you know how to deal with her, even though she might be annoying sometimes. The Fire Spirit's gonna go in A tier. It does a lot of damage for only 1 elixir, and kind of just like the Electro Spirit, there's just so many opportunities for it to get value. It pairs very well inside of Goblin Drill decks with Expo and also Logbait. The Fisherman's going to be going in B tier. Obviously, he pairs very well inside of Royal Giant decks. He's really nice for the King Tower activations and pulling things away from your win condition. And not only is he in Royal Giant, he's also seen inside of Giant and some other decks from time to time, and gets a really good amount of value in a lot of situations. The Flying Machine's going in D tier. It's just simply in a very bad spot at the moment because you never see it in the Lava Hound variations being used now, and also recruits are almost nowhere to be seen, so there's pretty much no reason to be using the Flying Machine. Believe it or not, guys, recently there has been a little bit more people using the freeze spell. It might be the current meta, but I've been seeing a bit of Graveyard Freeze, and also there's another freeze deck being used with the Giant Balloon Freeze, or even a couple people running Lumberloon Freeze. Even though it might be rare, it is in a pretty decent spot, and certainly a lot better than the clone, at least at this point in time. The Furnace is going in F tier. It just sucks. You can't really use it in any deck. The other issue for the Furnace is the fact that the Dagger Duchess and the Cannoneer pretty much can fully counter it by itself, so the Furnace Spirits don't even reach the tower. The Giant is going in A tier. He is still one of the strongest win conditions in the game, even though he recently got a small range nerf that didn't impact him too much. But I don't think he's S tier anymore because there's slightly less people using him. I'm seeing less Giant Graveyard overall. But with that being said, there's a lot of people using him with the Prince because the Prince is absolutely broken after the recent buff the Prince got, and there's also some people running Giant Loons, so he is pretty versatile. The Giant Skeleton's going in C tier. I think he's a pretty decent card overall. This is just not the meta for him. He recently got a health buff, which helped him out a bit, but I think the biggest issue is the Goblin Demolisher is just so much better and almost deals as much damage as the Giant Skeleton does, and because that's 4 elixir and the Giant Skeleton is 6, well, it kind of makes sense why the Giant Skeleton isn't being played too much at the moment. The Snowball is going to go in C tier. I think it's an average spell currently. There's a lot better than it, but it pairs very well with things like the Ram Rider, pushing units back, slowing them down, buying the Ram Rider more time to reach the tower, and it's the same case with the Balloon, and both of those two win conditions are quite strong. The Goblin Barrel is going in B tier. Goblin Barrel has made a pretty big comeback recently for a couple different reasons, I believe. One, because the Evolved Tesla is so strong and it pairs great inside of bait decks, but also because of the Dark Goblin buff. And the Dark Goblin is almost always used with the Goblin Barrel, which has really helped bring the Goblin Barrel back into the meta. The Goblin Cage is going in D tier. I'm going to be honest, that buff it got in the last balance change where they buffed the health, that hardly did anything. It still sucks because there's no one running it now. No one is using it with recruits. No one is running it with the Balloon. It's just not really being played, so that buff was pretty much insignificant. The Goblin Curse is the second card going in S tier, and oh my goodness, it almost seems like the emergency nerf it got did practically nothing. There are so many people using this card everywhere at the top of ladder. It is absurdly strong, and it is also very versatile. You can use this thing in cycle decks and also heavier decks. You can use it with the Goblin Drill. You can use it with P.E.K.K.A. You can use it with Balloon decks. You can use it with Miner. You can use it with the Lava Hound, the Giant. The list goes on and on. You pretty much can use it with anything you want, which is why they already announced it is getting a nerf in the upcoming balance changes. So hopefully that's going to help balance it out more, and those will be going live a few days after this tier list is being recorded. So just keep this in mind if you're watching this video about a week or so after I recorded it. Balance changes will have happened. And obviously the Goblin Demolisher is going in S tier 2 because just like the Curse, they announced it is getting a big nerf in the July balance changes, as it should get. I mean, it just gets so much value. It's already pretty good by itself before it even runs and explodes because, I mean, it throws bombs and it deals a good amount of DPS, but then when it loses half of its health, it just blows everything up that's next to it, dealing so much damage, and it almost sometimes feels like it's impossible to stop it from connecting to your tower, which is why it is so good. And basically every deck I name that you can run the Goblin Curse in, you can run the Goblin Demolisher in too, because it is absurdly versatile. The Goblin Drill is going in A tier, just like the Giant. Even after the small nerf the Goblin Drill got, it has still remained to be one of the strongest win conditions in the game. I think a big reason why is because of how broken the Evolved Tesla is, which pairs very well with the Goblin Drill, and then also the new Goblin cards like the Goblin Curse and the Goblin Demolisher pair perfectly with the Drill, making it even stronger too. The Goblin Gang is going to go in B tier. I feel like it's in a pretty decent spot in this meta. Not too strong, but not too weak. I feel like Bait being pretty good and the Dark Goblin buff help make it a little better because, of course, it is paired very commonly with the Dark Goblin and, of course, with the Goblin Barrel, so it's pretty good at the moment. The Goblin Giant's going to go in C tier. I don't think he's necessarily a bad win condition. I just think he's not very suited for the meta at the moment. I think one of the biggest problems is the Giant is simply a lot better, so there's not much of a need to run the Goblin Giant at the moment. And he also recently got 2 nerfs, which made him a lot worse. However, he is getting an evolution coming up soon, so that might help make him more viable. The Goblin Hut's going to be going in F tier, pretty much for the same reason as the Furnace and the Barbarian Hut. It's just so weak to things like the Earthquake and the Poison, and the Duchess can pretty much deal with the Hut entirely on her own. And the last of the new Goblin cards, the Goblin Machine, is also going in S tier. Now, I actually believe the Goblin Machine is the worst at the moment out of the 3 Goblin cards, especially after the emergency nerf. He ended up being a lot weaker, but he is still very strong because the Machine is also getting a nerf in the July set of balance changes, so hopefully that helps balance out all 3 of these Goblin cards because they have just absolutely been taking over the meta. And I can't tell you guys how many times I've seen people run all 3 of the new Goblin cards in one deck. That's how you know there's a problem and they're very strong. The Goblins are going in A tier. They are very valuable for 2 elixir now that there's 4 of them, but they're being used less at the moment because so many people prefer to use the Evolved Skeletons over them. And if you have the Evolved Skeletons in your deck, you obviously aren't going to have the Goblins because that would be really bad synergy. So for the most part, you're only seeing Goblins inside of drill decks and with the Hog Rider. The Golden Knight is going in D tier. He is potentially the worst champion in the game now, certainly worse than the Archer Queen. There just isn't really a deck that he can be played in, and it's a bit surprising because not too long ago he got a buff where you're able to use his ability slightly more often, but that has hardly helped him. The Golem is going in D tier. He is for sure one of the worst win conditions in this meta for I think 2 pretty big reasons. One, there's a good amount of people using things like P.E.K.K.A. because of the Ram Rider buff, and also there's a lot more people using E-Giant compared to the Golem, which of course counters Golem, and also because of the Elixir Collector being as bad as it is because of the Void, and Golem pretty much has to be played with the Elixir Collector, so if the Elixir Collector sucks, the Golem is going to also. The Graveyard is going in B tier. It is not one of the strongest win conditions like it normally is. The meta just doesn't suit it very well because things like the Goblin Curse are just so amazing against the Graveyard because of all the goblins you can get when defending it, and also Splash Yard is pretty much nowhere to be seen. The only Graveyard decks you are seeing are Graveyard Freeze or Giant Graveyard. Call me crazy, guys, but the guards are actually going in S tier. At least in this current meta, they have been absolutely insane. Certainly a lot better than the goblins, which is why I'm justifying them putting them in S. For starters, they survive arrows, they survive log, so they don't die to a lot of spells that people are using. They're also very versatile at the moment. Before, you pretty much were only seeing them with only the Lava Hound, but at the moment, that's not the case. There's a lot of people using them with the Goblin Drill. I'm seeing people use them even inside of some giant decks, Mortar, so they're pretty versatile at the moment. They just get a lot of value on defense. The Heal Spirit's going to go in D tier, definitely the worst spirit out of them all. I mean, you can use it inside of a Sparky deck if you really want to, or Bridge Spam if you really want to, but it is never going to be a requirement in those decks, and you're typically going to be much better off using something else. The Hog Rider is going to go in B tier. It is definitely not a very, very strong win condition like it normally is, and I think one of the biggest reasons for that is because of how strong the Evolved Tesla is, and it's pretty much impossible to break through an Evolved Tesla when you're running a Hog. And even the regular Tesla is difficult because you can play it high up, which is anti-EQ, and the Hog player has a very obnoxious time breaking through. However, the Evolved Tesla does pair very well with the Hog Rider, so the people running Hog do have that Evolved Tesla in their deck, which is very strong, so that kind of counters the fact that it counters it in a way, but still it is kind of an average win condition at the moment. The Hunter's gonna go in D tier. There's pretty much no reason to use him. It's kind of the same case as the Electro Wizard. There's just so many better options. Even inside of Royal Giant, there wouldn't really be any point in playing him when you can use things that are a lot better, like the Phoenix. The Ice Golem's gonna go in C tier. That small buff it got a little while ago helped it a tad, but I would still say it's a below average card. It does pair very well inside of Hog decks though, and a lot of the people running Hog are currently using the Ice Golem, and then you can use it in other things like Loon Cycle 2, which I do see from time to time. The Ice Spirit is going to join the Electro Spirit and the Fire Spirit in A tier. It can be used in the same decks that they're used in, things like Hog, Expo, Drill, and Logbait, so it kind of seems like whatever your preference is, you can use, because pretty much all of those spirits fit in a lot of the cycle decks right now. The Ice Wizard's going to go in D tier. It is pretty much unviable at the moment because there isn't really anyone running Splash Yard, and Ice Bow isn't good either unless you're Hunter. Shout out to him. But he pretty much sucks, and he isn't seen that often. This may seem a bit interesting, but the Inferno Drag is in S tier at the moment because there is so many people using the Inferno Drag inside of lava decks. Pretty much every lava deck has the Inferno Drag, but then I'm also seeing it inside of some balloon decks that don't have the lava, that have the Inferno Drag in it. I think there's a couple reasons for this. I think one is because there's a lot of beatdown decks in this meta, so people are using Inferno Drag to counter the other beatdown decks, even if they might be using a beatdown deck themselves, because there's also a lot of Giant, which the Inferno Drag is very good against, and the Electro Giant decks people are using oftentimes have the Inferno Drag in them to make it even easier to beat lava. So I think it's the type of thing where it's just because of the current meta that it's very strong, but it certainly doesn't need a nerf or anything. It's kind of the same case as the guards. And the Inferno Drag is also very good against the new Goblin cards, especially the Goblin Demolisher, but also the Goblin Machine. The Inferno Tower is going to go in C tier. Kind of like the Bomb Tower, I don't think it's necessarily a bad building, and unlike the Bomb Tower, it can actually hit air, but it's 5 elixir, so in many situations it's not getting as much value as the Tesla, and unlike the Tesla, it doesn't have an evolution, so it simply just isn't being played as much, but you can use it if you want to inside of Logbait or with the Goblin Drill. The regular Knight is going in A tier. Of course, the evolution is even more broken, but the Knight himself is good, which is why there's a lot of people playing the Knight and don't even have the Evolved Knight in their deck, and they're preferring to use other Evos instead. The Knight has a good amount of health, good stats for his cost. That's kind of the meme, but it's true. He can be played in pretty much any cycle deck you can think of, whether it's Goblin Drill, Logbait, Expo, Hog, pretty much any cycle deck you want he can fit in. Very versatile, very strong. The Lava Hound's going in A tier, for sure one of the strongest win conditions in this meta. I don't think it's as good as the Balloon though, because there's a lot of people using the Balloon outside of lava decks, and pretty much everyone using lava is using the Balloon inside of the lava deck. There aren't too many lava variations that don't have the Balloon. The Lava Hound is just pretty good against the new Goblin cards like the Demolisher and the Machine, and it just pairs very well with other strong cards in this meta, like the Balloon I already mentioned, and the Inferno Drag and the guards, so it's just in a good spot. The Lightning is going in C tier. This is lower than I normally place it because in the meta, it's having a rough time finding a deck it's good in. For the most part, it's only really being played inside of E-Giant, but that's about it because the Void has replaced it in so many decks simply because it just gets more value in most situations. Finally, guys, after like 5 nerfs, the Little Prince is no longer an S tier and it's going in A tier. With that being said, though, he is still the strongest champion in the game somehow, some way, and pairs very well inside of Goblin Drill decks, Miner, and you can even use him in some heavier decks like P.E.K.K.A. still if you want to, because he still gets a lot of value as only a 3 elixir champion. The Lumberjack is going to go in C tier. I feel like the Ram Rider buff has helped revive him a tiny bit because he pairs very well with the Ram Rider because, of course, when he dies, he drops that rage, and then the Ram Rider is obnoxious to deal with. And then I've even seen a couple people running some Lumberloon freeze. Even though it's overall not that good, I'm still seeing it a tiny bit, so the Lumberjack is in an okay spot, technically speaking. The Magic Archer is going in D tier. I feel like he really fell off for a couple reasons. One, of course, is the Evolved Bomber that can do something similar for half of the price, and also because of the Goblin Demolisher. Pretty much everyone is running the Goblin Demolisher right now inside of Goblin Drill decks or with the Miner, that there's pretty much no spot for the Magic Archer. Mega Knight's going in C tier. I don't think he's that great, but he's definitely being used a little bit again because of the Ram Rider buff. And of course, the Ram Rider pairs very well with the Mega Knight, so that was kind of a nice little indirect buff to the Mega Knight, and I'm seeing him a little bit more now. The Mega Minion's gonna go in C tier. It's pretty bad overall because the Phoenix and the Inferno Drag are just so much better. With that being said, though, there's some people that prefer to use the Mega Minion in decks like Giant and also with the Balloon just because it gives them a little bit of a faster rotation. So it's not completely bad. There's just better options, but it's still used a fair amount. The Mighty Miner's gonna go in B tier. I would say definitely one of the better champions in the game, better than the Archer Queen by a little bit. Not as good as the Little Prince though, but the Mighty Miner is very good with the Hog Rider and also with the Goblin Drill, which we're seeing a decent amount at this point. The Miner's going in A tier, not as strong as he used to be, but he is still very versatile now because there's a lot of people running him inside of Mortar decks, inside of Balloon decks. You might even see him occasionally inside of Lava. You could use him with Giant. You can use Miner Poison. You can use Miner Rocket. So there's a lot of variety, a lot of options you can play him in. I just think he fits so well in so many decks, even if he himself isn't as strong as he used to be. The Minion Horde's going to go in D tier. It's just simply so easy to deal with. There's so many counters to it like arrows, fireball, even things like the Evo Wizard that deals splash. Just wipe it out so easily, and it doesn't really fit well in any deck. The minions are a little better than the Minion Horde, and they're going to go in C tier. They can get a little bit of value before they die, even when you're against an arrow deck, and they pair pretty well inside of things like Giant Graveyard, or you could use them in Lava if you want to, but in general, there are going to be way better air cards you should use instead. The Mini P.E.K.K.A. is also going to go in C tier. I think of it as an average card now. It's pretty good against things like the Giant that are very strong in the meta, and it also happens to pair very well with the Giant too, but pretty much Giant is the only deck you're going to see it in, so it can't really be much higher than that. Mirror's going to go in F tier. It was used for that short time just because of how broken the Goblin Machine is, but now it's back to its place as being one of the worst cards in the game because you have to spend more elixir to play the same card, which is not optimal in most scenarios, and it makes your cycle very awkward. The Monk is going to go in C tier. It's sort of average, about at the level the Archer Queen is. I thought more people were going to be using it after the Ram Rider buff, but that hasn't really been the case. It isn't being used very much, except inside of Royal Giant for the most part. The regular Mortar is going to go in C tier. I feel like it kind of fell off quite a lot as a win condition. I think a big part of that is because there's a lot of people using tanks like the Giant, so it can be difficult to reach the tower, and you're just pretty much forced to use the Evolved Mortar every time. The Mortar itself, the regular version, I feel like is just not really that great, and it's very difficult to get a Mortar lock, and when you do, it's just not as valuable as the Evolved version where you're having that Goblin alongside alongside with it. Mother Witch is going in D tier. I feel like there's just not really a reason to be using it, kind of like the Magic Archer and the Ewiz, and there's also not a ton of graveyard in this meta, which is probably part of the reason why she's not at the best spot. I do think the Musketeer's a little better than the Mother Witch at the moment, which is why I'm putting her in C tier, because there's a fair amount of people using Hog with the Musketeer, and they're using the Musketeer inside of Hog over the Firecracker in a lot of cases. The Night Witch is going to go in C tier. She was really broken a couple months ago, but she has been toned down quite a lot because of the meta shift. For the most part, you are only seeing her inside of Giant decks. I think the reason why she's a lot worse is because Golem is in a horrible spot, and Night Witch pairs great with Golem, but if no one's playing Golem, less people are running Night Witch, and also because the Goblin Curse spell does quite good against the Night Witch that spawns bats. P.E.K.K.A.'s going to go in A tier. I think she's in a very solid spot this meta because there's a good amount of people using Giant, which she's going to be pretty good against, as well as the Goblin Machine. And of course, we can't forget about the Ram Rider buff, which indirectly buffs the P.E.K.K.A. as well, since the Ram Rider pairs very good with her. The Phoenix is going to go in A tier. For the most part, if you're using a heavy deck, if you're not using the Inferno Drag, you're going to be using the Phoenix. The Inferno Drag, though, is just ever so slightly better than the Phoenix at this point in time. There's a bit more people using it number-wise inside of the top 200, which is why I believe the Inferno Drag takes the edge over the Phoenix. However, there are so many people that prefer to run the Phoenix inside of their Lava and Giant deck. I feel like it really just kind of comes down to preference. The Poison's going to go in A tier instead of S tier that it's usually in. I think a big part of that, though, is because of the Goblin Curse. The Goblin Curse has sort of replaced Poison in many decks. Even though they're very different cards, they kind of have a similar purpose. So for that reason, it's not as good as it used to be, but it's still very valuable inside of drill decks, and with the Miner, you commonly see it. The Prince, guys, is going in S tier. Oh my goodness, is this thing absolutely broken after the buff. It went all the way from D tier to S tier, all because of the charge buff, where it's charging almost instantly. It basically takes a second now, when before it took about 3 seconds, which is why you're constantly seeing it in this meta, especially in heavier decks like Giant and with P.E.K.K.A., but you can also use it inside of cycle decks too, like Logbait he pairs very well in. Now, when you're watching this, he is probably going to be getting a nerf soon, because balance changes in July. They're nerfing his charge slightly, but I still believe he's going to be very good and likely at least A tier. Princess is going in A tier. Boy, has she been absolutely insane recently. A big part of it is because of the Dagger Duchess. She doesn't have to cross over the bridge, which means people have to overcommit and take her out, and then whatever you used to take her out dies with the help of your Duchess. So she's just so annoying to deal with, which is why she's being used a lot inside of bait. But not even just bait, you can use a Rocket cycle deck where you don't even have the Goblin Barrel, and the Princess is just the main win condition. That is how strong she is now. The Rage is going in B tier. Pretty strong spell at the moment, especially when paired with the Giant and the Balloon. I don't think it's one of the best spells, but it does get a lot of value, changing interactions and making things annoying for your opponent in a lot of situations. The Ram Rider, guys, I'm going to put in A tier. Just like the Prince, she is way better now. I believe she went from D tier all the way to A. However, I will say I don't believe the buff benefited her as much as the Prince, because they're a different type of card. The Ram Rider sometimes is a defensive card, so actually having it charge right away can in some situations be a bad thing if you're using her to defend something like a Hog Rider or a Balloon. Overall, it's a big buff to her, but it wasn't as big of a buff as the Prince. So I actually think maybe giving her the same nerf that they're giving the Prince in the work in progress balance changes that they're planning on doing might not actually be a good thing, because the Ram Rider, I don't believe, is as good as the Prince, even though she is certainly a lot stronger now. The Rascals I'm going to put in C tier, which is a lot higher than I normally put them in. I think the Dark Goblin buff and the Prince buff really help them out, because I'm seeing them a good amount now inside of bait once again. The Rocket is going in A tier. It is so strong at the moment, kind of similar to why the Princess is strong. If you can't break through the Duchess, well, don't worry. You don't have to. You can just Rocket cycle on the tower, which is why the Rocket is being played quite a lot inside of Rocket Cycle with the Princess, inside of Logbait, and with the Expo, you see it a fair amount too. Royal Delivery is going to go in C tier. I feel like it can be a very valuable spell sometimes on defense, but in this current meta, there isn't really any deck it's being played in, so I can't put it much higher than that. Royal Ghost is kind of in a similar situation to the Royal Delivery. It isn't really being played much in this current meta. It oftentimes synergizes well with the P.E.K.K.A, but in this case, there isn't really anyone playing it with the P.E.K.K.A, and there's not a lot of people running RG Ghost, so it's sort of an average card. The regular Royal Giant's going in D tier. I believe it's one of the worst win conditions in the game at the moment. I think one of the biggest reasons why is because of the Evolved Tesla, which is so strong, it's almost impossible to break through the Evolved Tesla, especially with a regular Royal Giant, where you're not getting that knockback against the units near it, and then also the new Goblin cards tend to do very good against it too. The Royal Hogs and the Royal Recruits are joining the Royal Giant in D tier. They're both in D tier for the same reason. Pretty much no one is running Recruits with the Royal Hogs, and also there isn't really anyone running Royal Hog Cycle. The Recruits, the only time they're being played at the moment seems to be inside of off-meta decks, but that isn't very good. The Skarmy, as well as the Skeleton Bearer, are also going in D tier. Like I said, guys, there's a lot of cards going in D tier in this tier list. It's just how the meta is at the moment. Simply put, they just don't really get a lot of value, and there's too many spells that counter them easily. The Skeleton Dragons, though, are going to be going in A tier. Maybe not a big surprise, considering how good the Balloon and the Lava Hound is this meta. It just has great synergy inside of Lava Hound decks, getting quite a lot of value in a lot of situations. The Skeleton King is going in C tier. I think it's about as good as the Archer Queen and the Monk at the moment. It's a little better than the Golden Knight, though. I think the problem for the Skeleton King is there isn't really a deck that it's good in. Maybe Elixir Golem, but Elixir Golem is in a bad spot at the moment, so the Skeleton King isn't really that good either. The Skeletons, I'm going to put in S tier. I know one of the biggest reasons why people use them is to, of course, to get to the evolved skeletons eventually, but there's so many people that are running skeletons in their deck and they don't even have the evolved skeletons. They're choosing to use the skeletons in 2 other evos. I think in this meta with all the broken cards, especially the goblin cards, the idea is to cycle to as many of them as you can. So the fact that they're 1 elixir cheaper than the goblins is helpful to have them in your deck just for that very reason in many situations, which is why I think they're better than the goblins and they're in S tier now. The Sparky's going to go in C tier. I think it's in an okay spot at the moment, but I believe that's mostly because the Giant is a very good win condition now. I don't know how great the Sparky itself is, especially because there's things like Void and Rocket that are so prevalent in the meta, which counter it so easily, but we are seeing it more when matched with the Giant. It's kind of funny because the Spear Goblins recently got buffed, but that buff didn't really do anything, and they're still in D tier. Probably a big part of that, though, is because of the Dagger Duchess, which just wipes them out super quick. As broken as the Evolved Tesla is, the regular Tesla is going in A tier because 90% of the people, or even more than 90% of the people using the Tesla have the Evolved version. So the regular version is good, don't get me wrong, and it's nice to have, especially because there's a lot of Lava Hound and Balloon in the meta. But let's be honest, the main reason people are using the regular Tesla is to get to that Evolved version, which is just twice as broken, it seems like, because you're getting that constant stun, and it's pretty much defending every single push. But the regular one, still very solid, and probably not a big surprise here. Log going in S tier as per usual. You can use it in every single cycle deck. I'm not even going to bother naming them because pretty much any deck you can think of that cycle, you can use it with. And even though the Goblin Curse is very strong, it didn't seem to impact the Log negatively. In fact, there's a lot of people using Log and Goblin Curse in the same deck. Even though they're both small spells, they pair nicely together. I'm actually, guys, going to put the Three Musketeers in F tier. Normally, I put them in D tier, but because of how bad the Elixir Collector is, that makes them even worse than they normally are. And I personally, I could be wrong, but I don't think the Three Musketeers are ever going to be good again unless they get a small buff, which is why I'm putting them in F. Tombstone's going in C tier. It's not really in the best spot. I would say it's an average building now, simply because no one really runs Splash Yard much anymore, and a lot of the lava decks don't even have a building in it anyways, so it really fell off because it used to be A tier for a very long time. The Tornado I'm going to put in A tier. Normally I put it in S tier, but in this meta it doesn't seem to be too broken. I'm mostly only seeing it with the E-Giant and also with the Goblin Drill. And most Goblin Drill decks don't really have the Tornado, but when it is played, of course it can be very valuable in a lot of matchups because of the King activation or just clumping things together. So I don't think it's ever going to be a bad card no matter what the meta is. The regular Valkyrie is going to go in D tier. I honestly think she's pretty bad. The only reason people use the Valkyrie is to get to the Evolve one. There's practically no one playing the Valkyrie and only the regular Valk unless you're in mid ladder, simply because the Knight is just better in pretty much every single situation. The Void is going in S tier. It didn't even matter that it got that small nerf in the last balance change where the first hit doesn't come in as quickly. It is still being played in every beatdown deck that is strong. You see it inside of Lava Hound, you see it inside a Giant, and you see it in P.E.K.K.A. Those three decks it's pretty much played in every single time, and it's why the meta is so different. It pretty much alone is what killed Elixir Collector. That's just one example of how much things have shaked up because of the Void. The Wall Breakers are going in D tier. Pretty much nobody is playing them, especially at the top of ladder, unless you're using the Evolve Wall Breakers. It's just almost impossible to reach the tower with them unless you overcommit and have a tank in front of them, because otherwise they won't make it because of the Dagger Duchess. Pretty much she can take them out on her own. The Witch is going in F tier. Personally, I wouldn't mind if they give her a small buff, especially because the Wizard recently got an evolution. Now there's practically no reason to use the Witch. The Goblin Curse is also very good against her, and things like the poison, so she just has a hard time being viable. The Wizard is going in D tier. The only reason why it is not joining the Witch in F tier is because he has a very, very broken evolution. And the only time I put a card in F tier is if I think a buff could be justified, and I really don't think giving the Wizard a buff would be a good idea because of his Evo, and that's why he's in D tier. The Expo's going in B tier. Even with all the Giant and tanks in this meta, it is still having a good amount of success, and I think a large part of it is because of the Dagger Duchess. It's the same story as the Princess. It doesn't have to cross over the bridge, which is just a guarantee to make it a decent win condition. The regular Zap sucks. It's going in D tier. It's the same story as the Wizard. The only reason why people are using the Zap is to get to the Evolve Zap, which is absolutely broken. The Zappies are going in F tier. The reason for that is they have sucked the last few months, and especially now, I think that they're even worse with all the new cards in the game, the evolutions. No one is playing them with the recruits anymore, that I honestly wouldn't mind them getting a small buff. The Princess Tower is going in A tier. I still believe that the Dagger Duchess is better than her, but the Princess Tower isn't bad now. There are some people that are actually preferring to use her in a couple decks at the top of ladder or in competitive. For the most part, Duchess is preferred, but now she's finally not far behind now that the Dagger Duchess ended up getting 2 nerfs that made her significantly worse. The Cannoneer I'm going to put in C tier. I want to make sure there's at least 1 tier of a gap between the Cannoneer and the Princess Tower, because I think the Cannoneer is by far the worst tower troop in the game. Ever since they gave him that 5% DPS nerf, he has just been a lot worse because there's a lot of interactions that are just simply not the same anymore, and because he has a lot less health than the Duchess and the Princess Tower, it's just very hard to use him. The Dagger Duchess is going in S tier. Even after the nerf she has gotten, it hasn't seemed to impact her that much, and she is still people's tower troop of choice for the most part. She just annihilates things so quick. She is so broken, especially in single elixir, and then I think even in double elixir, she's still the best tower troop, and only when triple elixir comes around would I say she starts to fall off quite a bit, and the Princess Tower might be better than her in triple elixir. But with how the game is currently, a lot of games are fast paced, so the game is ending before triple elixir even happens, which is why the Duchess is so good. And lastly, guys, I rank the evolutions. I actually decided to rank them separately because I saw in a lot of my tier list videos, You guys asked if I could do them separately, so let me know if you guys prefer like this or you want them together with the other cards. Maybe if it's like this, it's more simple and it isn't as complicated. Evo Ice Spirit, a lot of people would probably agree with me as it being the worst evolution. Nothing has really changed since it came out. The recruits just kind of got killed after they got all those nerfs. They're basically just like regular recruits except they charge. The Evo Battle Ram, of course, is going to be pretty bad, especially when the Evo Tesla is the best Evo in the game at the moment. It's impossible to break through that. The Evolved Goblin Barrel slightly better, which is why it is C tier, because Logbait's a bit better at the moment because of the Dark Goblin buff and also because of the Prince. So we're seeing it slightly more now. The Evolved Wall Breakers aren't that great because of the Dagger Duchess, like I've talked about with the regular Wall Breakers. It's hard to get them to reach the tower. The Evo Mortar isn't really that good ever since it got that health bonus removed. Now it just fires a goblin, so there's a lot less people using it. Evo Bats are slightly better, but they're pretty easy to deal with spells, which is why they're not that high up. And then the RG, for the most part, is just like the regular RG, except it has the ability, but that ability can be pretty useful, especially when you're against ground decks. The Evo Archers deal a lot of damage. They can be nice to have, but they die to arrows. The Firecracker is actually a bit better. Normally, I would say she's C tier, but at the moment, there's a lot of people using the Evolved Firecracker, especially with the Hog and the Drill, so she's making a bit of a comeback, even though she dies to arrows. The Evolved Barbarians are primarily used inside of Lava Hound, but of course, they pair very nicely with it, and they don't die to Fireball. The Evo Valk, though, better than the Evolved Barbarians for sure, because she can be used inside of other decks like Drill, for example. The Evolved Bomber is a bit worse now that it's a 2-cycle evolution, but it is still very, very broken, especially inside of Drill decks. The Evo Skeletons, one set of Evolved Skeletons can cost you the game, but I do think they're slightly worse at the moment, and there's just so many Evos that are better than the Evo Skellies, which is why I don't have them in the top tier. The Evolved Wizard obviously has to be an S tier, which is why he's getting a nerf in July, but I'm kind of surprised the Evolved Zap, the Evolved Knight, and the Evolved Tesla are not getting a nerf as of now because they are absurdly broken. The Evolved Zap is basically being used in pretty much every beatdown deck at the moment. You're seeing it constantly with Lava Hound, Giant, and P.E.K.K.A. It just gets an insane amount of value, which is why it is being played so much. The Evolved Knight, even though it got a nerf, it is still in S tier. I cannot believe it. It has gotten by now 3 or 4 nerfs, and it is still as broken as it is just because people like using it as a tank, and it is just simply very versatile. Evolved Tesla, you guys already know what I'm going to say about it. It is insanely broken, by far the best building in the game. It is pretty much impossible to break through it when you have an Evolved Tesla down. When you have it down, you pretty much are guaranteeing that you're defending whatever your opponent drops, and even when it does finally go down and die, you're getting that additional shockwave, which is why it is as busted as it is, and I definitely think it needs to be nerfed in the next set of balance changes. If you guys enjoyed this tier list, make sure to give it a like and subscribe. These take me a very, very long time to make. They're actually the longest video of all the videos I make. They take the most amount of time, so I'm glad you guys really do enjoy them. Your support is what makes them continue to happen every month. You guys can use creator code BOSS to support me in any Supercell game, and thanks again until next time, guys.